his thinking was not like, does God exist or not exist? Irrelevant. His
Okay.
question was, how do we make meaning in a life that has already become secular in function?
Hmm.
Um, but
Yeah. So there is. I mean, obviously, yeah. I think that there are many terms or phrases, sayings in philosophy that are just often misunderstood. Even Descartes, I think, therefore I am, is misunderstood a lot
for
of time.
sure,
And yeah, I also learned that part about Nietzsche, as you were saying, right? So there's a specific context that comes with what he was saying,
yeah,
right? Um, I guess more with me, it's actually concerning like whether actually God exists or not. So like philosophy of religion, I'm really interested in. So have I mean earlier, I think you were mentioning that you're more like a physicalist, right?
yeah.
So just physical things exist, and in that view, would you say that there are any spiritual, any immaterial things at all?
Uh, I mean, I'm sort of agnostic on the question, right? It's
Okay.
not so much like these things certainly do not exist, but more like we can't really know. Probably better to operate with the assumption that they do.
Mhm.
Uh, that's sort of how I come at it.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, there are two routes. Like one route is just to simply like argue for something that is indeed immaterial, and I think many people would say, for example, the mind would be immaterial
Yeah,
because it seems like the mind is different than the brain, right?
yeah.
But obviously they're connected somehow, um, and the mind is just not material, not physical. Would you say that that's one route that you would?
The mind is not material. Is the
Yes, it's not
claim?
material, it's not physical.
Um. So depends how you define that, I guess. Because I think that like the experience is. I actually would argue that consciousness is a physical phenomenon.
Mhm.
But it's also because it's social. There becomes an element that is, I guess, in a sense, like not material, but that doesn't mean it can't be understood by its component parts. When you get into what was the term? Cybernetics, right? Uh, which cybernetics people often associate with like robots and transhumanism and whatever. But the way it was traditionally used was just meant a system of interrelating systems, right? So like the social, which emerges from physical relations, creates like the mental or like consciousness, right? And I think that can be explained within physicalism.
Yeah, so it creates the consciousness. And would you say that the consciousness that's created itself is physical, or would you say that it's immaterial? So, for example, you have that consciousness of the table. The table would be physical,
Right.
but would the consciousness of the table be physical itself?
The concept of the table,
The consciousness of the table?
the cautiousness,
Consciousness?
consciousness of the
Yes.
table. So like our conscious experience of the table.
Yes. Would that be physical?
Uh, so maybe the experience itself is not physical, but the experience can be explained by physical interactions that do actually exist.
Sure, sure. Yeah, like obviously you still have that physical interaction through your brain, your vision with the photons that are reflected from the table. That's physical, right? So certainly I agree there. Um, it seems like you were saying that then that the consciousness is itself not physical, if I heard that right. Um, and if so, would you say your consciousness does exist?
Um, I mean, there's two routes you can take it, and I don't really. Maybe consciousness exists separate from the mind, and it's something our mind accesses. I'm skeptical.
Okay.
Or consciousness is like an emergent physical property that doesn't exist in its own right.
Right. It'd be very interesting to see how we just have a whole bunch of just particles hitting each other, and
Yeah.
somehow that from that we emerge from that emerges such complexities with consciousness that seems very orderly as well, right?
Yeah.
Like the way that, just imagine right now, like the way that we are conscious of the world, it's in a really strange way, really ordered, really consistent,
Yeah.
right? So like, why is it that my consciousness um, consists? It really reflects, what is true, right? So for example, it's really true that I don't know. I hear the music, that there's a smoke over there, that there's a person walking by. It seems really orderly and really consistent in that way. Um, if it is so orderly, wouldn't we say that actually, yeah, this thing, it would be more likely explained on the realm of this immaterial mind being God,
Right.
creating our immaterial mind, and now we have this orderly, consistent consciousness, rather than just random particles in naturalism and physicalism that just hits each other, and randomly we have this emerging.
For no reason.
Yeah.
Right. So what I would say is that, like, as far as we can understand from like particle, from like physics, um, the way we like see things in the world are not necessarily how they really are. A good example of this is there's a huge, there's wavelengths that our eyes interpret as colors, but there's a huge spectrum of colors that humans can't see.
Right.
Right? And so our brain is making legible a picture of the world that is actually would be totally intangible to us. So our brain is funneling the amount of information down to a useful subsection of the information that we can like understand.
Mhm.
Which you could actually take in a religious, you could take that as an argument for religion, equally as much as you could take it in as an argument for physicalism. But I don't necessarily think it goes one way or the other.
Mhm. Yeah. So, for example, with the lights that we do see, at least, right? Obviously, I agree. We don't see every single part of the spectrum,
Yeah.
but we do see it. At least with the part that we do see, there's a consistency, there's an orderliness about it. So it's not like my eye right now. It tricks me into like, or at least our eyes as a collective whole.
Yeah.
Like just out of nowhere, tomorrow, our eyes, we will all be seeing the color, the actual real color blue, as actually red somehow.
Right.
Like tomorrow, all of our eyes. Like that's really unlikely to happen. Why? Why is that? It seems more like, okay, if we want to say that that's consistent, that's orderly, which I think many of us would agree it is.
Yeah.
We have two hypotheses once again. One hypothesis, just random emergent things from these random particles, or there's this orderly, this consistency in us waking up tomorrow, still seeing blue as blue, because there's this, this infinite mind. Yes. In God.
Yeah.
I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
So like comparing theories in a way. Bayesian analysis, similar to that.
so like I wouldn't necessarily say that it is like random the way we perceive things. It's more like because like different animals see things differently, right? Like dogs can only see a very limited palette of colors compared to what humans can see. Um, and so like and then that goes on with different creatures. I think that like the particular way humans understand the world is not random, but a like emergent evolutionary adaptation to create the most useful sort of like selection of information for our particular niche in the ecosystem.
Right. So it seems to me like, at least with the latter part, so the particular niche in our ecosystem, evolution, whatever it may be, I think that as long as we have, like great evidence for it, like scientific evidence, yeah, we should believe in these things, and they're consistent with the Christian worldview, the worldview that there's a God.
Yeah, it doesn't
It seems to,
preclude theology or belief in God.
right. The reason that I say that, Quinn, is it seems to me like it doesn't preclude what I was saying earlier, really, which is that comparison of the two theories. I mean, we have to choose between one of the two if they are the only two options we have.
Yeah.
Or at least on the table right now that we're considering.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like, it seems to me like when we say that the better theory that would better predict the consistency, the orderliness in the way that we have consciousness in, in as applied to reality, it would be better predicted on the worldview that there's this infinite mind, or at least some kind of greater mind, a creator mind.
What's the term Spinoza uses? The the um,
The substance, the one substance.
the
He
one
does talk about the
substance.
one substance, yeah.
Yeah.
The one substance, God's worldview, God's bird's eye view, that kind of idea.
Yeah.
So, like with that, right? Wouldn't that be a better predictor of the consistency, of the orderliness of what we have going on? Then what I would say is random. I know earlier you said it's not random. It seems to me like it would be random if at the fundamental level we just have these subatomic particles hitting each other, and then somehow we can't even like we don't even know where the points are until we really observe them.
Yeah.
That seems like it's pretty random, right? And yet, how do we get from that randomness to, oh, by the way, there are these complex organic um, organisms that are composed of parts, and now it can have consciousness, meaning us, right? It seems like that's pretty incredible.
I agree.
Whereas the view that is more likely is, where there's this God creator mind, Spinoza style, maybe.
Well, so Spinoza was a pantheist.
Yeah, I
in
know.
a
I know
sort
he
of
has that kind of view.
absolute sense. I don't know how your channel works, but if you upload these, I don't know. But the so like Spinoza's view of God was one infinite substance that composed the whole of the universe. But he was also not a believer in an active God. So when he talks about God, he's talking about the whole universe in a way that isn't active or even necessarily observant or conscious of what's happening, right? And so he does talk of God. He certainly does. He uses his word a lot. But it's not God the way we would think about it in most theology, right?
Right. So for him, God is the only substance.
Yeah.
What that means is actually, I thought back then, I thought that he believed in pantheism.
Yeah.
Which is the common view, but actually I would say he doesn't, because pantheism would claim that there are two or more substances that are gods. But for him, there's only one substance by definition, because a substance is the thing that um, does not depend on anything else.
Pantheism seems consistent with sort of physicalist, not physicalist exactly, but this sort of kind of a weird way to frame it, but like this sort of like secular monotheism, right? Because pantheism just contests that like the universe is God, which could be taken in sort of almost a pseudo animist direction of like different like world spirits and things like this or whatever. But in Spinoza, I see no contradiction. Where I see no contradiction between pantheism and Spinoza's view, which is of one world, one God, one universe composed of the infinite substance that is God.
Right. Let me ask you this, right? Would you say that there's a difference between one and two?
Yes.
Yeah, obviously, right?
Yeah.
So for Spinoza, there's only one substance.
Mhm.
Out of the whole reality, there's only one substance. But for pantheism, it would claim two or more substances. So there's a difference there automatically, I would say, right? So for example, I think that we can, for example, go to God from natural reasoning. So like Romans 1:19, for what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, is verse 20, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. Right. So there is the world, and indeed from the world we can see its various changes. And from these changes, we can see, how indeed it does lead to God. So I think that natural reasoning could lead us to God. And yet, I think that we can also have wrong views. I don't believe, it depends on how we define substance, I guess. But Spinoza's view is very contested. I would say that at least it is
I mean, he got
inconsistent.
excommunicated. He's one of the only few people in modern-ish history to get excommunicated from Judaism. Not
Oh,
something that happens very often. It's
yeah.
very contested. Very, very contested.
Certainly, yeah, yeah. I mean, there's that, right? And so now here's the thing. I think that in Isaiah 1:18, for example, God says, "Come, let us reason together." Right? Though your sins be as red as scarlet, they can become white as snow. Right? So that's the reality. Like God is a God of reasoning. Um, he's a God who's logical, and so I would say that there's a way in which we can still arrive at Him through our natural reasoning, and indeed we should follow our consciousness. But if we do know about Him, then like in Spinoza's example, I would imagine he was following his consciousness, right?
Yeah.
So, and in that scenario, yeah, he should follow it. But I think at the same time, the consciousness should be, it should be formed. It should be formed because I think about this, right? For example, in John 15:22, Jesus said, "If I had not come and spoken to them, they would have not been guilty of sin, but now they have no excuse for their sin." Because Jesus came and spoke to them, right? So when he speaks to them, they know the truth. He says, John 14:6, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." The classic, right? The classical one.
Yeah.
You know that one. So when he says that, that would be true, and one would be held accountable if one doesn't put real consideration into it.
So, can I throw a big claim out there?
Sure.
This isn't a claim that I believe.
Okay.
But I think the argument is consistent. Okay, let's say all of the New Testament literally happened exactly as written.
Mm-hmm.
Why should I believe that Jesus is exactly what he says he is and not simply, why should I believe Jesus is God on earth and the Son of God and not simply a bodhisattva?
Yeah. So why believe that he's the Son of God and not just? You said what?
I
not
use
just
the word bodhisattva.
What is that?
So in Buddhism, there's this idea that you can escape the cycle of suffering through non-attachment, but
Mhm.
then there are people who take themselves back into the cycle of suffering on purpose to try and improve the world and release others from suffering, which in these tales act as sort of almost as like almost as gods on earth. So let's assume Jesus performed all the miracles.
Mhm.
Why would I assume him to be the son of both the Son of God and God on earth? I don't know how you feel about like Aryan Christianity, the idea that Jesus was just like a prophet rather than
not a god,
not a god,
for example. Yeah. Right.
But like what? How do I get from point A to point B? Is basically what I'm asking.
Yeah. I mean, for example, I think that's a great thing. I mean, John 8 talks about the truth a lot. Jesus talks about how he's the truth, right? And the reality is, for example,
the stuff he said.
Yeah,
I
like
seems
loving
like
neighbor.
A great guy.
Yeah. Great wise teacher, perhaps.
Challenge the Roman Empire, challenge religious authority. No complaints from me.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Right on. Yeah. So I'll give you an example. Right. Verse 43 and onward. "Why do you not understand what I say?" Jesus is speaking here to the Pharisees. "It is because you cannot bear to hear my word. You are of your father the devil," so he has strong words for them, "and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there's no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. But because I tell the truth, you do not believe me? Which one of you convicts me of sin? I tell the truth. Why do you not believe me? Whoever is of God hears the word of God. The reason why you do not hear them is that you are not of God." And he says, if you do not believe me because of the works, right? If you do not believe, for example, the words because of me, believe at least the works, right? And from the works, John 14, Jesus already shows, Jesus shows himself. Let's see, verse 10. "Do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me?" So like that question, right? So why not saying that Jesus is in the Father, Father is in him? "The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does his works. Believe me that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or else believe on account of the works themselves."
Okay.
right? So I think that if the whole New Testament were true and historical, Jesus died and rose again from death. He performs miracles, casting out demons. He looks for the poor, those who are the outcast. He sends love. He sends compassion, and he's also willing to speak the truth. As you yourself would be very interested in speaking the truth.
For sure.
Like if he's willing to do all these things, and top it all off, prove it with his miracles, and he also says that he's God, which I think we can get into. Um, like why wouldn't we believe it if there's so much evidence, right? That's my kind of ideal thing. What do you think?
I guess like what I'm saying is I don't necessarily think that precludes an interpretation where God could act through other people as well,
Okay.
right? So like the Baha'i, like the Baha'i also accept Muhammad as a prophet, and then I don't know how. I don't know what his
Are
name
these
is.
Muslims? Muslim groups?
So Muhammad, founder of Islam,
Yeah.
the prophet in Islam, and then the guy who founded Baha'i, whose name I don't remember.
Okay.
And their argument would be that Jesus was sent as part of a divine revelation, but that one that he was a prophet and not necessarily God himself.
Not God.
You quoted this line to me. I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. Was the line?
Yeah.
Am I
Yeah.
got that right?
Yeah.
So like you see similar things in the Old Testament with prophets like Elijah and Moses say similar things. But in Judaism, for example, the claim isn't made that Moses was God on earth,
Right.
or that Elijah was God on earth, but merely they were prophets on earth that God acted through. And so my question becomes like, why couldn't what precludes assuming the same thing couldn't be true of Jesus as they believe in Baha'i and in Islam?
Yeah. And that same thing that you're talking about is that Jesus would not be God, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I think that one of the reasons why we would not say that Jesus is not God is because Jesus said he was God and he backed it up.
Where does he say he's God?
Yeah. I think that's a really good question. So I'll give you an example right here. In the book of John, chapter 8, verse 58. So actually, it was in the same chapter that we were talking about, but another verse, right? Well, let's start with verse 56. So you mentioned, the Old Testament as well, you know. So here Jesus says, verse 56, your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. Now, what's key here is Abraham was like hundreds of years before Jesus.
I think thousands.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet, well, at least hundreds, for sure. Yeah, thousands.
Yeah.
And yet, Jesus said, Abraham already saw Jesus' day and was glad. So the Jews said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, ego eimi. Now that word ego eimi is God's name in Exodus 3:14.
Okay.
When Moses was talking to God in the burning bush, and he said to God, God, I'm going to go talk to the Israelites, and if they ask, what is this God's name? What am I to tell them? And then God says, tell them, I am who I am sent you. And so that's God's name. I am who I am. Ego eimi. Then what do you have? Jesus literally saying, before Abraham was, ego eimi, for himself.
Okay.
So Jesus is eternal before Abraham, and he is that God. Yeah. And just to top it all off, right? We don't stop there. Verse 59, last verse. So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. So why did they pick up stones to throw at him? Well, presumably because that's blasphemy. Jesus just used God's name for himself.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say, Jesus basically just claimed to be God.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah. And of course, and as you mentioned, right, going back to that original thing you mentioned, why does it matter if the whole New Testament were true? Uh, if it seems like it could actually be consistent with, say, for example, the beliefs of other religions or other prophets or whoever they may be, right? I would say that if it were consistent with the truth, then sure. But it seems like this would be a direct contradiction, right? So, for example, Islam says Jesus not God. Christianity and Jesus himself says Jesus is God. So that's a direct contradiction. It's an either or. And I think very clearly, yeah, Jesus is God. And I mean, with the Islam point, right?
No,
So,
that seems fair.
yeah.
That seems like a fair way to read that.
Okay. Yeah.
I guess like my next. Sorry, I
Yeah, no
interrupted
worries.
you.
No worries, Quinn. Yeah, go ahead.
My next question would be about historical lineage of particular gospels.
Mhm.
Um, I think only about how many books are there in the New Testament?
You have it is 73 in total. 73 minus, I think it's 27. 27. Yeah, I don't know.
27.
It's been a while since I've done the calculation.
So only about like 6 of those are relatively contemporary to the times when Jesus was alive.
Okay.
Which is to say, our first copies of them emerge maybe like 50 or 60 years after the time when Jesus would have died, assuming the accounts are all true. Which actually, I think the crucifixion narrative, it's reasonably historically verifiable that the crucifixion narrative, at least Jesus being crucified,
Yeah.
is historical. I think that's a reasonable thing to assume.
Hmm.
But when you eliminate the books that are not contemporary to the events of the New Testament, which is to say within about 100 years, a
Okay.
lot of these like more these larger theological claims become very hard to make because you're left with only about 6 books. I can look in my notes which ones those are if you're down,
Yeah.
but if you got a response here, then we can.
I think that's so I think I'll say a few things. So obviously, I think that it would be more than 6 books, and scholars differ in their opinions concerning this. So, for example, some scholars will date Peter's letter to like 2nd century,
Yeah.
whereas Christian scholars they definitely don't think that. Many Christian scholars, at least, maybe
Did them much.
maybe some of the liberal ones are willing to date it later, but usually the more conservative ones say earlier. But I would let's say, for example, obviously I believe that it would be more than 6, but I'll even say for the sake of argument that it's only 6.
Okay.
I think that even with the 6, say for example the 4 Gospels, usually people say that's fairly early. Maybe John being the latest, maybe.
Yeah.
That's also contested. 80, 90 with John. Um, I would say maybe it's like 80, 75 if I remember right in one of the calculations, or maybe even before 70.
Yeah.
And but in any regard, right, that's still within the living memory of Jesus. 4 Gospels, you have the death, uh, the entombment of Jesus, and then the resurrection of Jesus.
Yes.
What would you
Yeah.
say concerning, I don't know, that at least?
Those stay.
Mhm.
Those stay. But like this claim, which Christians accept as doctrine, would like not appear in those sort of older original, like whatever the number is, books.
Okay.
I will say that it's not totally it is reasonable to assume like, well, these probably didn't just appear, but then you get into like you can date them the same way you can the older books and figure out about when they emerged, but then you get into like the same problem with the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament or the Tanakh or whatever you want to call it,
Mhm.
where like for example Deuteronomy doesn't show up until like 200 years before the birth of Jesus. Deuteronomy was only added when the Israelites were in a time of like dysfunction and displacement. So they added significantly harsher like ritual purity laws, which they used to create more of an in-group identification.
Mhm.
Uh, but then, like Paul and Jesus both rely on Deuteronomy very extensively to argue for basically the opposite of what they are, the reason they originally added to the book.
Yeah. I actually don't remember the exact dating of Deuteronomy.
Yeah,
Um, so it seems to me like you would be saying that it's somewhere around 200 BC,
yeah,
right? Presumably, if Jesus was born, say, for example, in 4 BC, 1 AD, whatever. Um, Actually, I don't really know if that matters all that much. If
okay,
we already granted that what Jesus said in the four Gospels of the New Testament are
it's
true,
true.
right?
Okay, okay,
Right. So like that's going to be the fundamental thing. And obviously, I'll say that one of the things, I mean, just to sort of address this side point that I don't think really matters ultimately.
sorry.
Like no worries, yeah. Like with Deuteronomy, right? Like I haven't studied the actual dating, but let's say I even grant for the sake of argument that's 200 years before Jesus' time. Well, I think that we can have that document, and yet the reality is it actually dates to way back then. We just lost the documents,
Okay,
and that oftentimes does happen in history. Um,
for sure.
yeah, and so yeah, I mean, I don't worry if we don't have original documents because we don't have a lot of
A
original
lot of
documents for
original
many things.
documents.
Yeah,
Yeah, for
so
sure.
yeah, but ultimately that doesn't really matter if we already granted, as you mentioned, as you granted earlier, that the New Testament would be true,
Yeah,
from what Jesus said in the four Gospels. Um, so, for example, right, going back to that original claim, if the New Testament is true, Jesus said, "I'm gonna die, I'm gonna be in the tomb, and I'm gonna resurrect," and it
mm,
actually does happen.
yeah,
And here are my teachings, and follow them.
yeah.
Shouldn't we follow that then? Because he proved himself, as he said, if you don't believe me, at least believe me because of the works.
Right.
Um,
Um. So like, my issue with that is that if you go back to like older, uh, so he proves himself through acts, right? Um, but I don't think that means necessarily that everything. This is gonna sound like a crazy argument. I
okay,
understand,
let's see.
but even though he proves himself through acts and does all these miracles, um, what why assume for sure that everything he says is like therefore true?
Um, maybe we don't assume it, but I thought that you were already granting it earlier when you said that.
So I was granting that the events happen,
Okay.
not that every single word someone says in them is true.
Hmm.
So like we're assuming the New Testament as a historical document,
Hmm.
but not that every single thing anyone says in it is true,
Sure. Yeah.
right? Um,
You grant the essentials,
yeah,
death, burial, and resurrection as being true.
yeah.
Okay.
For
But
for the sake of argument,
okay.
I
Interesting. Okay.
I, I
That's an
don't
important clarification,
I
of course.
don't think the resurrection happened, but
Yeah.
that's such a messy historical argument
Hmm.
that I'm like, okay, this is a reasonable thing to grant.
Hmm.
Like,
Yeah. I mean,
I don't
do you
feel
think
like
that that would be essential? I mean, that's usually where I would go. Like if one were to ask, like, why is Christianity true, and ultimately, why should I believe in it? Not because exactly because I want to, convince the person right then and there.
yeah,
Because I think convincing is it's a whole process, pretty confusing, concerning how one lives out one's life, the commitments that one has, all the different doctrines, etc. The physical, emotional, spiritual changes that one has to go through in one's life. So there's a whole process. Oftentimes, it's not just a one-time thing.
so
Yeah.
I think if I was convinced of the historicity
Hmm.
of the resurrection of Jesus, I would be a Christian.
Hmm. Yeah.
But I'm not.
Yeah. Okay. So that's why I would say it's like the
Yeah,
essential claim, right? So
yeah.
it was important for me, I think, because I was a little bit confused on what you meant by you conceded, as you mentioned earlier.
It's
Um,
useful for
yeah.
having a conversation within the framework
Hmm.
while still trying to like sort of explore the nuances.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
So I think that that would be where I'll be interested to go if you're. So basically, yeah, there are many arguments on it. I mean, like I'm getting ideas from Brant Petrie, um, from Willie Lane Craig, Michael Lacona. These are scholars. Gary Habermas. Gary Habermas, he's done some study some studies. I think he did studies on mass hallucinations, either him or William Lane Craig.
Yeah.
And basically, mass hallucinations are not found anywhere in their research.
Yeah.
And that's important because what we see in 1 Corinthians 15, for example, is what Paul sent to the Corinthians, right? Verse 3. For I deliver to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, and he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then James and all the apostles.
Yeah.
So what's significant here is Jesus appeared to like more than 500 people. And once again, Gary Habermas says that the hallucination hypothesis is not
I
found
will
anywhere.
completely grant that mass hallucinations do not exist.
Okay.
Completely, not for the sake of argument. I just think that's true.
Okay.
I guess my question is about. I have no doubt that these documents, So my question becomes like, how do we know that claim is true? Just because it's written.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Because I have no doubt that the claim is made. Right. And if I'm convinced that he did in fact do that, then we've got a good like historical grounding, right?
Yeah.
But what's the evidence?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question or great concern. Just great concern, Quinn. I think that's where I was planning to go as well. Let's suppose, for example, you have a really good friend of yours, and this really good friend, he's been very reliable. He says he's gonna be here, and you see him like always 10 minutes early or something.
Yeah.
And this man is just a solid person. He just loves people. He likes to be kind. Just all the above, right? And this guy goes out and tell you, hey Quinn, I'm gonna have a radical worldview change, such that even though I was not a believer in Christianity, now I'm a believer in Christianity because Jesus appeared to me and he said, it was me actually inspiring me this whole time to do all these good things or something. I don't know, whatever it is. So for you, Quinn, you know this man. Would you say that your credence level in your friend really having this experience rather than just him hallucinating, really having this rather than him hallucinating and or making it up, it would be more likely that this guy is like actually having this experience, right? Right, this friend of yours, like pretty close friend, versus this stranger who you barely know. Maybe the stranger is actually bad. Like somehow he's done a bad thing and you actually see him and he says, I had this experience. In these two cases, these guys made claims, but you would trust that friend of yours more, maybe because he shows himself to be reliable.
Trustworthy?
Yeah, sure. And so why does Paul show himself to be a trustworthy person who accounts for the Gospels? Well, because we go to Philippians chapter 3. I think this is where basically Paul shows himself to really have been good. He's okay. He was so okay in the other life, right? So he says, though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh also, as a Jew, he's talking about his ethnicity, as he's talking to the Jewish people. If anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, the Jews did that, of the people of Israel, of the Jewish people, of the tribe of Benjamin, look at my pride, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church. So that's a good thing, right? So Judaism was against the church, the Catholic Church, the Christian church. As to righteousness under the law, blameless. But whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. Now, what's important is in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he talks about him having been beaten multiple times, stoned.
And Paul is very, very historically well accounted for. I will say that.
Okay.
Paul is 100% like real guy. Complete, like, no question about that. That's so.
Yeah, 100%. And so with Paul, having lived this very, very great life, right? He was zealous. He was righteous in the law. a Pharisee. Benjamin, he was high up. He was learned, a learned guy according to the book of Acts. He learned from Gamaliel, who was a very high, great teacher in Judaism. He learned from him, so he was good. And yet, why would he change his life to Christianity? Full of beatings, persecutions, as he said in 2 Corinthians 11, anxiety, in hunger, in thirst, nakedness, running from enemies, in danger of, just enemies. Yeah, just like shipwrecks multiple times. Why would he go from that very comfortable life to this life of being a Christian with barely any incentive, right? Like he's always talking about. Obviously, I'm saying this with hyperbole.
Well, maybe he had a moral conviction that made him want to challenge the religious institutions of his time and the political institutions of his time. That wasn't necessarily related to an actual experience. And so when he has this conviction to become Christian, that's completely real. That's a real conviction, but it's a moral conviction that the religious law needs to change and the law of the empire needs to change. Not necessarily because of real supernatural experiences that happened, but because of the frame of the time of this very superstitious world. I actually think one of the great values of Christianity is that if you look at pre-Christian religion, like Hellenism or like Roman polytheism, the entirety of their moral system emerged from habit and ritual, rather than from deriving an ethical framework from a set of moral principles. That's the great moral innovation of later Jewish monotheism and later Christianity. But I don't necessarily think that's proof that the supernatural events literally happened.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So in your view, for example, you would say that it's not so when he preaches the gospel, right? When Paul is preaching the gospel, showing that he believes in Christianity now, even though he lived his life before, it was not really because he saw evidence, saw Jesus or something, but it was more so because he just found this moral conviction that Christianity has a better kind of morality that would fit with his framework.
Yeah, like the moral framework we have now, any of my options I find intolerable. I see Christianity. I'm going to join this and help create a new one that's better.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is a noble thing, absolutely a noble, worthwhile pursuit.
Yeah.
I don't see that as less valid, especially in historical context.
Sure. Yeah.
But I don't see it necessarily as a reason why I should be a Christian today.
Yeah. I'll give you a consideration right quick. So in 1 Thessalonians 2:13, Paul says, "When you received the word of God, which you heard from us, you accepted it not as the word of men," so not as the word of Paul, "but as what it really is, the word of God, which is at work in you believers." So in the mind of Paul writing this, he himself is willing to make the statement that actually this is the work of God, the word of God. So
Yeah.
And so it's not from Paul. It's not just Paul's conviction. It's not just Paul's morality, but it's Paul who thought he was in the right, who thought he was all good, comfortable, morally speaking, even, right? So
Yeah.
Jew of the Jews, zealous, a persecutor. So
Yeah.
that's praiseworthy in Judaism at that time because they thought that Christ was not really a prophet, and that's blasphemy, and that's worthy of death, for example. And so he was persecuting that. That was good in that Jewish mindset at that time. And yet he changed to Christianity. It seems like that would be such a radical shift that it would not just simply be something that Paul says, "Oh, well, I just had a change of mind concerning the moralities of Judaism. It doesn't seem to have as much merits, or it doesn't seem as true to live off of than the merits and the truthfulness of the morality of Christianity."
Yeah.
He didn't even say that anywhere. For him, it was Acts chapter 9, Acts chapter 9, verse 15, where he had that experience, and God said that Paul would be a chosen instrument of his, right? That whole experience, he falls off the horse, he gets blind, sees, he hears the voice of Jesus saying, "Paul, Paul, why do you persecute me?" And he said, basically that Jesus saying that Paul was persecuting him was Paul persecuting the body of Christ, aka the church.
Yeah.
In that spiritual sense, it would be the church. And so Paul actually converted, according to his own words and his own accounts with Luke as well, because of this experience. Not so much, not so much just because of his change in morality. Um, I don't know. What would you say concerning that, perhaps? Quinn?
So I'm not saying that it says. I'm not saying that there's a passage in the Bible that says is Paul saying I'm becoming Christian because I find all of my options for moral guidance and religion intolerable.
Mhm.
I'm not claiming that exists. I'm claiming that like the moral universe that people existed in would require this like masterful creation of this mythology in order to change the moral framework, to lay the groundwork for that to grow,
Right.
right? Um, but you're right. It is a good question why that would happen so quickly, and that does seem reasonably consistent across accounts. So I I think that's fair actually. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. So without being fair, like, would you say it's fair as in if we were to compare? So there's a data, right?
Mm.
What is written down, what we see historically.
Yeah.
Um, what would better predict the data, right? Would you say that what better predicts the data is Paul? I'm not sure. Let me see if I understand it first. Would you say that Paul had the intent of getting a better moral framework and he found it in Christianity and so he turned Christian? Would
Yeah.
that be something? Okay. Um, okay, so there's one hypothesis of the data. The other hypothesis is, well, Paul had this vision, according to his own words in the data, and that's why he changed. And in this life as a Christian, he actually does not have a lot of incentives. In fact, he actually goes through a whole lot of suffering.
Really, it's like it's really barred really fast.
Yes. And so it goes from being righteous in his own eyes, being zealous, persecutor of the church, Hebrew of the Hebrews, a Benjaminite, something worthy to be proud of, into this really like terrible situation where he's persecuted. Given that data, what hypothesis would we say is more likely? The one that you.
So if this is the only data we're accepting, then
Mhm.
then I think the Christian assumptions make sense,
Okay.
right? But the problem for me is that I have to go and I would want to go and look cross reference with like Jewish sources from the time, Roman sources from the time, see if we can find other people who remark on this sudden moral transformation.
Mhm.
Because if our only source is Paul, then maybe he's exaggerating in retrospect. And this was actually a gradual change over time, right? If we can find a Jewish or Roman attestation of Paul, who was a pretty major figure at the time, like
Sorry,
because
perhaps.
there are attestations to him
Yeah.
for sure.
What would that attestation look like? Perhaps what were you looking for? So like of his existence merely, or like etc.
I would want to see like maybe a rabbi or Roman spies or the Roman government saying Paul suddenly converted to Christianity. Obviously, it would have been framed differently at the time because, like, Christianity is a distinct religion, hadn't fully solidified into its own thing yet. Not in a theological sense, but in a social sense. Does that make sense?
Sure, yeah.
I would need an attestation from the time uh, of this sudden change of mind
Mhm.
from other sources.
Right. Okay. Would you say that it must be a Jewish source and or Roman source? Which I mean, we would imagine that it could be fairly biased as well,
True.
or would it be possible for it to also be a Christian source? Because presumably, if one sees such a change, that would be convincing evidence for one who is witnessing it, and thus one would actually be a Christian. And if one is a Christian and writing this down, one would be a Christian historian.
So your claim is that if you're a Roman pagan or part of the Pharisees or the Sadducees, you're not going to want to record this change
Right.
because it looks bad for you.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess I just it's not that it has to be it's not that it has to be one of these two,
Okay.
right? If there are other Christian sources other than just Paul attesting to this change at this time, I think that also works.
Yeah.
I just need cross references that line up
Mhm.
and are extra textual.
Sure, and that's fair, and we work off of building up of evidence. So I like that, Quinn.
Yeah.
So for example, in the book of Acts, which is fairly early, some scholars date it to like before AD 70 Acts. Luke is writing this. Then they cast him out of the city and stoned him, and the witnesses laid down their garments at the feet of a young man named Saul. And as they were stoning Stephen, he called out, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." And then Stephen dies. But what we see here is Paul, or Saul back then, he himself was already persecuting Christians. He was there during the stoning of Stephen, who was a Christian, right?
Yeah.
And so then later on, we see in Acts 9, as I mentioned, right? Like, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? That's Jesus speaking to him. And he said, "Who are you, Lord?" And he said, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. Arise and enter the city," etc. He changes his mind.
Yeah.
So Saul then turns to Paul. And we see this written by the historian and physician Luke, right? And so we have a source outside of Paul showing that Paul used to be living this kind of life of persecuting Christians as the Jew, and yet now he's turned Christian. So would you say that that's a piece of evidence that is worthy of consideration?
So I do think it's a piece of evidence that's worthy of consideration. I don't think any serious historian would claim that the Bible is not useful as like a historical document, but the way that we use historical document is messy, right?
Sure.
Because that doesn't mean it's necessarily a literal accounting, right? We look at like the Epic of Gilgamesh. We know the Epic of Gilgamesh didn't happen, but it's still very, very useful for understanding the culture and society
Sure.
of the time, especially because other records are so limited. So I'm not saying it's an invalid piece of evidence. I'm just saying that when we get claims of such enormous significance, it's really dependent on being able to cross verify with other people.
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
So maybe the typical Christopher Hitchens claim, right? Greater claims, greater evidence needed, right? Maybe I think people intuitively would agree with that. Maybe I don't agree with that actually. So I'll give you an example. Would you say it's pretty? Sorry, go ahead.
I'm not. I'm not asking for like, oh, I want them to dig up all the rocks and bones and carbon date, and I want 5,000 independent attestations. I want like 2 or 3.
Okay. Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Cross references.
And that's a pretty normal like expectation of evidence. I think.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. So I mean, it seems like we have 2 already, right? So like Paul being 1 and Luke being 1.
Okay. All right.
And if you take, for example, the early church fathers, we call them the early church members. I don't know who exactly. I would imagine Irenaeus would have talked about Paul. What's his name? Papias, I think his name was. He's dated to like the early 100s. He was already attesting to the Gospel of Mark being written very early on.
Yeah.
Etc. But I mean, that's obviously specifically about Mark, not specifically about Paul. I would say here's how we can think about it, right? So like, Paul is one piece of evidence, actually, for the bigger claim of Jesus' resurrection. We're actually not so concerned about just Paul himself. Like, what more evidence do we have for Paul? But rather, what more evidence do we have for the resurrection?
Yeah.
Right, so Paul is one figure that we've been really digging deep into. But obviously, as you mentioned as well, you want like cross references, multiple pieces. Matthew, you have Mark, you have Luke, you have John, you have the book of Acts would be written by Luke as well. But you have the early church fathers, Pliny the Younger, you have Irenaeus, you have Ignatius, etc. Many characters who are, it's just so much to name. people who are within the century of Jesus' life or within 2 centuries of Jesus' life, very early on, who are attesting to the fact that he died, he rose again, and yeah, he died, he was entombed, and he rose again. And one thing that I think that's so important is sometimes I'm not saying this is exactly a view, right? But sometimes we take our standard for evidence to be so high that it's just anachronistic. For them, a lot of it was just oral traditions.
Yeah,
And Richard
sure.
Bauckham, um, I think his book it's called The Eyewitnesses or something like that. The Four Witnesses, Richard Bauckham, by Jesus, super incredible book. He basically shows how important oral tradition was for the early,
Oh
early
no,
parts.
I'm familiar.
Yeah, and so I mean, given that, right, the fact that we do have at least 1 or 2 or 3 written accounts is just absolutely amazing already. That's treasure for that time.
Yeah.
Um, and what we do have then is primarily it's passed on orally, and we see that the early church fathers passed it on 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, Middle Ages until even now. So basically, that tradition has passed on from just multiple characters, multiple people. And once again, Paul saying that more than 500 brethren having seen that, and Luke attesting to Jesus walking around, seeing his disciples eating a physical fish. Obviously showing them that he's physical as well. Jesus is physical because the spirit can't eat the fish, right? People washing their faces, waking up in the morning, and then still seeing Jesus there, talking to him, hearing him. These are clear evidence of like just a whole bunch of people seeing Jesus, I think, and it will be very incredible to deny it. I think very hard to deny it. I think that obviously in history we have to see the data and then see which hypothesis better fits the data. It seems to me like from all the other data, hallucination, hoax, resurrection, seems like the resurrection would be best explaining the data.
Again, I would need you run into the issue that like it's not like the Pharisees is like an empty term, right?
Sure.
That's just became rabbinic Judaism,
Mhm.
and they have their own explanation of what happened that very much like does not like does not like coincide with like the Christian narrative of what happened,
Mhm.
right? And I don't know why I have to assume that one of these narratives or the other is 100% true
Mm.
or accurate.
Okay.